Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Stench of Truth Radio here on Blog Talk Radio. That's blogtalkradio.com/the Stench of Truth, all one word. I'm Ted Torbich, otherwise known as Tenebrous T, T-E-N-E-B-R-O-U-S-T. Some of you may know me from my YouTube channel. I do political and economic videos for the most part on YouTube. And my username is Tenebrous T, T-E-N-E-B-R-O-U-S-T. And my show on YouTube is also called The Stench of Truth. You might also want to check out my blog, which is tenebrous-the-stench-of-truth.blogspot.com. And for anybody that is joining me today for the first time, this is a show that primarily focuses on the paranormal, esoteric, and the occult, issues that I sometimes get into on my YouTube videos from time to time, but that I have decided to bring to the radio show here on Blog Talk Radio to discuss in greater detail with a host of guests that I have had in the past and that I will continue to have in the future. And today's guest is Peter Levenda, who hopefully will be joining us shortly. I'm going to read a few things here by way of introduction for anybody who does not know who Peter Levenda is. He is an author and researcher who has been around the occult and esoteric scene for a long time. If you do a search for him on the internet, you will find many interviews that he has given, from podcasts like mine all the way up to Coast to Coast, Red Ice Radio, etc. He will be involved in a conference, I believe, in April. I don't have that in front of me right now, but that's going to be on the Secret Space program, where there will be a couple of other speakers there as well, including Richard Hoagland and others, to talk about the Secret Space program. So let me get on with reading some of this introductory material for you, so you'll get a handle on where Peter Levenda comes from and where his work primarily focuses on. There is a fan page on Facebook for Peter Levenda, and that's where I'm going to get this first little bit right here. First part of it is from Wikipedia, which is a very, very limited article on Peter Levenda, but nonetheless, here goes. Peter Levenda is an author who focuses primarily on occult history. He is best known for his book Unholy Alliance, which is about esoteric Hitlerism and Nazi occultism, and is also the possible author of the Simon Necronomicon. He was the president of the International Division of Ortronics Incorporated, a telecommunications company based in Asia. He appeared in the TNT documentary Faces of Evil as an expert on Nazi history with special regard to occult and esoteric practices. He has also appeared on the History Channel special Nazi Prophecies. Levenda lives in Miami, Florida. Here's some further information on the Simon Necronomicon, which some of you may be familiar with. Levenda is also believed to be Simon, quote-unquote, the author of the Simon Necronomicon, a purported grimoire that derives its title from H.P. Lovecraft's fictional Necronomicon, featured in Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos stories. The assessment of Peter Levenda as the author of the Simon Necronomicon is based upon the following sources. The U.S. Copyright Office registration for Simon's Gates of the Necronomicon lists the author as Peter Levenda, whose pseudonym is Simon. On the radio program Coast to Coast AM, Sunday, May 10th, 2009, Peter Levenda was asked directly by the host, Ian Punnett, if Peter was in fact Simon, which Peter denied. Mr. Levenda did acknowledge working on the book with Simon. Ian Punnett made a reference to interviewing Simon and mentioned similarities with Peter Levenda and asked Peter to, quote, say hello to Simon for him next time he saw him, end quote, to which Peter laughed and said that he would. Also, of course, there's Unholy Alliance, which was the first book of Mr. Levenda's that I happened to read, and just a little brief snippet on that would be important, I believe. And Unholy Alliance is a history of Nazi involvement with the occult. And here is a description at ravenoir.com. This comprehensive popular history of the occult background and roots of the Nazi movement shows how the ideas of a vast international network of late 19th and early 20th century occult groups influenced Nazi ideology, from Madame Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley to the Thule Gesellschaft, the Order of the Golden Dawn, the Order of the Eastern Temple, and the pseudoscientific expeditions to Iceland and Tibet of the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society, which is also known as the Ahnenerbe SS. Nazi appropriation of the occult was a weird farrago of astrology, Freemasonry, racism, rooted in occultism and popular European folklore. The Cathars, the Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, the Arthurian legends. It also traces the Nazi movements as they continued their activities after the war. The Nazi rat lines to South America, the colony of righteousness in Chile, otherwise known as Colonia Dignidad, or morphed into neo-Nazi skinhead and satanic groups such as the Christian Identity and White Aryan Resistance movements. Engagingly written, Unholy Alliance is a comprehensive popular history of the occult background and roots of the Nazi movement, showing how the ideas of a vast international network of late 19th and early 20th century occult groups influenced Nazi ideology. And, of course, you can find all of his books on Amazon.com. And, in fact, on the episode page, the scroll, the books will take you directly to the Amazon page if you click on them. But you'll note that the 3 Sinister Forces books were published by Trine Day, and my good friend Chris Milligan, who was a guest on this show several weeks back, is the publisher at Trine Day. So if you do not have the Sinister Forces books and you want to buy them, I would strongly encourage you to do business with Trine Day directly rather than going through Amazon.com, simply because it will be supporting a fellow truth seeker and someone who is doing an incredibly good work for alternative researchers and authors, and providing an outlet for people who may not normally get published. And the catalog of books that is offered by Trine Day is very good, so do check them out at trineday.com. Again, the publisher there is Chris Milligan, and if you're interested in hearing some from him, you can also check the archives on the show and listen to the interview that I did with Chris Milligan a few weeks back. Now, the most famous work of, I'd say probably the most famous, I can't say definitively, but the most famous works of Peter Levenda are probably the Sinister Forces books, which I believe to be a tour de force when it comes to the occult underpinnings of society today, and how those sinister forces have served to kind of, it's hard to describe. They sort of made the United States go crazy as a collective nation, infiltrated the subconscious of the entire country, and served to create a schism in the mentality of the nation as a whole. And this can be traced through political assassinations and all of the other various things that have happened throughout history, not the least of which, of course, would be Manson and the infamous murders that he was involved with, which Peter Levenda goes into some detail looking at in this context, plus the idea of the psyche of the country being affected by a sort of collective delusion, which hopefully I'll get him to expand upon whenever he is on the show. And this goes into the idea of mind control and the CIA's program of MK Ultra and all of the other spin-off programs that have come and gone during the decades in the wake of World War II. So what I want him to elaborate on is the idea that MK Ultra and the mind control programs that were conducted by the intelligence agencies not only serve to interfere and disrupt the psyche of the individuals who are involved in those programs, whether witting or unwitting, but also served as a psychotic break for the collective consciousness of the nation, which is what I think he's getting at in the Sinister Forces books, but I want him to elaborate on this as well. And so hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that. And also, of course, as I mentioned, he's going to be doing a conference coming up very soon. I believe that's at the beginning of April, where he will be talking about the secret space program, NASA, and Nazis. Now, of course, a lot of you have also been made aware of the fact that the National Aeronautic and Space Administration has been infiltrated by so-called ex-Nazis ever since it was created. And I think this is the focus of where Peter's talk in the upcoming lecture is going to be. So by way of a final little bit of introduction, which I think hopefully I have Peter on the line right now. I just have to check to make sure. So give me a moment, and I will get on with the show. I appreciate your patience. Okay, everybody, I do have Peter on the line. I just wanted to make sure that it was him there. And as a final little teaser for you, I just wanted to read the beginning part of Unholy Alliance, because I really like the introduction, because it begins with the introduction is At the Mountains of Madness. And Peter's writing style is very good. If you're not familiar with it, you should definitely read it, because it's eminently readable, even though it is a very deep and sometimes troubling subject from which he is writing. And this is the introduction, At the Mountains of Madness, to Unholy Alliance. 4 o'clock in the morning of an Andean winter found me shivering and alone on the streets of a small farming community in central Chile. It was profoundly dark, as only a poor village of sleeping farmers can be, but it was not silent. From every side came the endless crowing of roosters and the unnerving howling of dogs, like a soundtrack from hell. There is something biblically ominous about a rooster crowing in the night, and when compounded by the braying of unseen hounds, one's composure is shaken into splintery fragments of old horror films. Monster movies, yes, and documentary films as well, for the 20th century has given us a surfeit of both, and it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between them. I remembered grainy scenes of goose-stepping soldiers, military vehicles groaning through the streets, civilians murdered in their homes. On television, when I was a child, it had been World War II in black and white. Today, it was the Republic of Chile in living color. And that's from the introduction to Unholy Alliance. And, looks like I lost Peter. Hopefully he will get back on the line here. Well, that's the nature of Blog Talk Radio. Unfortunately, we do have some communication problems. Sad to say. But hopefully he'll be back shortly. I'm going to bring up the Secret Space site right now just so I can give you some background on what he's going to be talking about on here it is here. Let's see. That's the Secret Space Program and Breakaway Civilization. That's going to be April 3rd in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And let's see. The speakers will be Peter Levenda, Timothy Good, Richard C. Hoagland, and Richard Dolan. So I guess if you're in the Netherlands, you should definitely go up there and check it out. Let's see if I have Peter here. Is that you, Pete? Is that you, Peter?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
yes,
I lost you. Okay, you're on the air. I'm sorry about that. We do occasionally have a little bit of trouble here on Blog Talk Radio with the connection. But let me take a minute to welcome you and thank you for doing the show today. I really appreciate it. If you weren't here for the beginning, I went into a rather lengthy prologue of your work, and I couldn't help but mention the Simon Necronomicon, of course, which is kind of a controversial subject, but talking also about the Sinister Forces series of books, which I believe are probably amongst the greatest books ever written to look at the underlying structure of society in America and the infiltration of our society, most notably through science and technology from the end of World War II. And I wanted to get some further ideas of you in that regard when it comes to the psyche of the nation as a whole, when it compares to MK Ultra and mind control programs being conducted on individuals here in this country, and how that might have affected the psyche of the nation. But before we get into some of the more interesting aspects of what you've done with your work with the Nazis and your upcoming program that you're going to be involved with in the Secret Space program in the Netherlands, I wanted to get the whole Simon Necronomicon thing out of the way first, since I have you here to talk to live. I'm not going to bother asking you if you're Simon, because you have denied this fact every time you've been asked this question, and I think it's kind of pointless to go on with that. But I did want to ask you a little bit about the book itself, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
Now, it's my understanding from what I've looked into this is that the Necronomicon was actually a book that was acquired by an acquaintance of yours. Is that correct?
That's true. I mean, the story is told in Simon's book, Dead Names, which is sort of the history of what happened and how it happened, including some documentation to support it. And there was a very famous theft of rare books that took place in the early 1970s.
Yes.
And it was a number of monks of a rather strange Eastern Orthodox church, and they made their living by going into libraries, public libraries, university libraries, some private libraries, and archives, and basically stealing whatever they could. They wore these long robes, and back in the early 70s, people did not really question clergymen as much as they do now. I mean, someone dressed as a clergyman could get away with almost anything, and that's really that experience that I had in the Orthodox churches as well is what turned into Sinister Forces. I mean, it became the sort of touchstone for that. Anyway, so a lot of stolen books made the headlines in the New York Times and Christian Science Monitor and newspapers across the country at the time. And people went, nuts, and librarians, book collectors were especially dismayed because the monks would quite often cut artwork out of the books and sell them separately, or cut maps out of the books and sell them separately. It was a total desecration of these books, and it was just terrible. So that book theft was, the guy they worked for, religiously, not as a fence, but as the person who was their bishop, was extremely fond of books about occultism. And so whenever they came across something on palmistry or astrology or ritual magic, a grimoire, anything like that, they gave it to him to keep him satisfied, to keep him quiet, so they could go on and continue their own work, their own theft. So that's what was going on. That's how the book was acquired. The manuscript was acquired initially. No one knew what to do with it, and eventually it was Herman Slater of Magical Child who recognized the name Necronomicon, and he was a big Lovecraft fan. I had never read that stuff, and neither had any of the monks that I knew, or neither any of the clergy that I knew at the time. So we were in the dark about it, but it was Herman Slater who said, "Oh, you've got to do something with this. You've got to translate it. We've got to publish it." So he was the instigator. He was the person who said, "Oh, Necronomicon, that's Lovecraft." And I had a blank look on my face, and he said, "You've never read Lovecraft? You don't know anything about it?" And I said, "Sorry, no. Didn't do the Tales of the Crypt stuff. Didn't really grow up with that literature at all. I mean, I'm not putting it down. It's just that it was just not part of my background. So, that's in a nutshell. That's how it started."
So, did you ever actually see the actual original manuscript yourself?
Sure.
And was it actually in a book form, like with?
No.
Okay. Was it like loose leaf or?
It was just manuscript pages in a box, and
I see.
kind of a gray box, like an archival box that you might store loose pages in if they were valuable, with the pointed corners, and it was a very sturdy box, and the pages were in that box. So there was no cover on it, there was no binding, on it. It was just a manuscript.
And in retrospect, what is your feeling on what that represented? Was that actually a legitimate quote unquote grimoire that someone put together, or do you think ultimately that what was presented as the Necronomicon there was in fact something that was cooked up by somebody? I mean, looking back now, what's your opinion of it?
Well, looking back, I would say it was a grimoire. There's no doubt in my mind that this was a workbook of some kind, that it was a magician's workbook. I think the controversy comes in where we talk about the Necronomicon as being, the Lovecraft Necronomicon, and that's where you get into a lot of controversy naturally, and I'm very well aware of it, and and I can sympathize with it. I think it's hard to say definitively that this is the book that Lovecraft referred to. As far as it being a workable grimoire, everyone who's worked with it has come back to me and said that it's a workable grimoire. I mean, it works. Kenneth Grant probably is the most famous proponent of that particular book. He died just a little while ago, I think at the end of January, but Kenneth Grant is, at one point was considered the head of Crowley's OTO. He's written a lot of books on the occult, very deep books on it, and he realized all the controversy around the Simon Necronomicon, but he insisted that this was a received text, that it was a holy book just as much as any other, and he quoted from it extensively in his own work. So that's probably an indication, on the one hand, and on the other hand, William Burroughs thought it was great. So there you go. Okay,
Well, you might not agree. Well, you might not agree with Kenneth Grant's particular occult philosophy, but I would certainly grant the fact that he is eminently a knowledgeable person when it comes to the occult. So I would trust his judgment on the fact to decide whether or not something is a workable grimoire of magic or not. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to get your take on that now with a little bit of hindsight on the whole affair. Of course, I have read about the Necronomicon and your particular your take on it and your involvement with it over the years, and I just wanted to hit on it just to see if you had any new ideas or any new reflections on it in light of all of the things that have come and gone over the years and as relates to it. But I appreciate you filling us in on that a little bit.
Sure.
Okay, so before we get into your works and talk about some of the things that I really want you to get into, which I think are very important, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing with the Breakaway Civilization Secret Space program that's going to be held in April?
Yeah, that's actually just a week from today, I think, is when it's going to start, or a week from tomorrow in Amsterdam. And my contribution to it is going to be in the area of the origins of the American space program and how we brought over the Nazi scientists for Operation Paperclip and a few other projects like that in order to help jumpstart our space program and what that really means. A lot of documentation has been coming to light, declassified documents over the last few years, including recently the Justice Department stuff that they declassified a lot of their files on Nazi war criminals living in the United States. So it's bringing this to people's consciousness again. It's going to make us ask some very serious questions about my particular angle is that we at some point bartered our soul for this. I mean, we decided that the end justifies the means, that we would work with Nazis in order to get a jump on the communists. This was basically what the Vatican had done during World War II, which is why they helped many of the Nazis escape using Vatican passports and Vatican safe houses and an escape route to South America. So we found ourselves in the same position. We found ourselves dealing with the enemy. I mean, basically selling our souls to the devil for this. Mm-hmm. So I look at that, and I look at what happened in the years after that, how our space program developed, who were the prime movers, mostly all former SS officers, mm-hmm. and at the same time, what impact did that have on, for instance, the American political scene in the 1950s and 1960s? How was our culture and our life affected? And in particular, the very strange connection that exists between the space program and the Kennedy assassination of John Kennedy. Absolutely. So there's a lot of weird stuff there, and when I write about Sinister Forces, I'm focused, of course, on the bizarre coincidences that surround these major political events like assassinations. Mm-hmm. And there's one school of thought that says it's all conspiracy, and there's another school of thought that says all that data is just coincidence. And I'm trying to promote a third school of thought that says it's something beyond conspiracy and coincidence, perhaps. That it goes back to the idea of Sinister Forces, that there's a quantum effect in history. And then if we can look at coincidences and trace them back, we can see what the influences are. We can see, who's really pulling the strings behind these vast political events.
Well, it sounds fascinating. I wish I was able to make it to Amsterdam, not only to hear your talk and to be at the program, but also check out Amsterdam as well, which I'm sure is a really beautiful city in Europe. But that sounds very fascinating. Now, Richard Hoagland's going to be speaking there as well. I know some of his work has focused on looking at the Masonic connections to the space program in the timing of the launches of the Apollo craft and the landing sites and things like this, and the fact that there are a lot of Masons that were involved in NASA itself. and I was wondering if you had any particular input into the idea of a cross-connection between the Nazi influence in NASA and the Masonic influence in NASA, especially in light of the fact that you did recently publish a book about the Masons.
Well, my focus, of course, began with the Nazis. Once I started work on a Holy Alliance, I had, an embarrassment of riches there to work with. But also there is a strange angle to this story, and that started out in California in the 1940s. At the time that we're working on the Manhattan Project, and we're also trying to bring the Nazi scientists over. We have a program set up to bring them over at the end of the war to help with our defense space program, which your listeners should realize that our space program was not initially a peaceful program. It was under the auspices of the Pentagon. It was a military program until NASA was formed years later. So it had a military application initially, as we saw with V-1 and V-2 rockets that the Nazis were launching into England. Our interest in space was basically a weaponized space. So on the West Coast in California, you had a bunch of scientists who were working on defense-related space problems. And one of them was a famous young scientist by the name of Jack Parsons. Mm-hmm. Now, Jack Parsons influences the story a great deal from the so-called Masonic end, in that Parsons was a devotee and a follower of Aleister Crowley. He was actually a member of one of Crowley's groups, the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, and ran it for a while, ran the lodge in California.
That's what I was going to say. He was the leader of the lodge out there, yeah.
Yeah. He was in Pasadena. He was very much involved in occultism. He transformed his house basically into a meeting place for occultists of all kinds, but primarily with an emphasis on Aleister Crowley. And his contribution to space was developing certain types of fuel that could be stored aboard ship without deteriorating, which was a major problem during the war. They would have rocket fuel, but after a couple of weeks or months at sea, the fuel was either too explosive or it was basically useless. So he solved that problem. There's photographs of Parsons with rockets that they're building out in the desert in California, trying to launch rockets with people like Theodore von Karman, very famous space engineer, who was sort of his mentor. And Parsons was one of the co-founders of the Jet Propulsion Lab, JPL, which then eventually sent rockets to the moon. So Parsons' influence was tremendous, and there's a crater on the moon named after him. But he was considered himself to be the Antichrist. He really identified with this idea that he was going to overthrow Christianity and that he was going to help Aleister Crowley institute the law of Thelema, the new aeon, the new age after Christianity. So Parsons was a very, very serious guy when it came to the occult, but also very, very serious when it came to space science. And his influence was very strong in our fledgling space industry. And then he got blown up in a very bizarre accident that a lot of people say was not an accident. He was on his way to Mexico to live. He had lost his security clearance for a number of reasons, one of which, of course, was his involvement with the occult. He was subject to an FBI investigation. He was also involved with a Chinese scientist who then was accused of being a communist, and he got disgusted and went to China and helped develop the silkworm missiles in China. So when you're dealing with the occult in the space program, you have a rich load of information to deal with. There were a lot of occultists involved in the space program initially. And of course, I have to bring up the fact that Parsons also inadvertently helped jumpstart Scientology, and with his relationship with L. Ron Hubbard and taking Hubbard out into the desert, and raising spirits and conjuring demons and that sort of thing. And Hubbard took Parsons' money and took his girlfriend and went to Miami, absconded with it, got married a second time, became a bigamist, as it turns out. Hubbard was, and basically that was the origin of Scientology. Hubbard used to talk glowingly about Aleister Crowley, and at one point claimed to have met Crowley, which actually was physically impossible. Crowley had died in 1947, and Hubbard was nowhere near England, where Crowley was. But Hubbard used to talk glowingly about Aleister Crowley. So you have a Scientology, space science, occult stream that is fully documented, and it's just fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So we're going to be touching on some of that in Amsterdam next week.
Well, Jack Parsons and all the connections with him, with L. Ron Hubbard and Crowleyism and the OTO and his, as you say, questionable death is a subject that could be talked about. We could do a whole show just about that, I'm sure, or even more than one, because just the story of his involvement with L. Ron Hubbard and the Babylon working and the subsequent, as you say, stealing of his girlfriend and all of his money and the absconding away with it of Hubbard, which sort of painted a picture for the rest of Hubbard's life, I would guess, in a way.
Oh, yeah.
And it's quite a fascinating story. And Jack Parsons is a fascinating character. One, like I rate him right up there with Crowley as far as being the real deal when it comes to serious and very deep occultists and magicians, if you want to use that word. Someone who took very seriously the work that they did in this particular field. And I think a lot of other people who have been, so-called names within occultism and magic really do so simply for the glamour of recognition, what have you, but don't actually put the time and effort into it, right or wrong. I'm not trying to judge one way or the other whether what they're doing is good or bad. Just wanted to acknowledge the fact that I think that Parsons was the real deal when it came to delving into the occult, and it's important to acknowledge that because there are a lot of people that come and go on the scene, as you're well aware of, who claim to be these big, I used to know this guy and I was involved with this and that, and they don't really know what they're talking about. But Parsons was a major player in that game, and anybody listening who has not done any research under Jack Parsons, you should definitely do so, because you'll get a tremendous amount of information, not only about the beginnings of our space program, but also a tremendous amount of information on the occult and occultism in the United States. So that's definitely a subject worthy of looking into. If anybody wants to do that, I highly recommend that you do so. A very fascinating subject. Okay. Well, of course, the first book of yours that I read was Unholy Alliance, and I'm sure a lot of people would contend that that's one of the most important books on the idea of Nazism really being the identification of Nazism as a cult, and having all the trappings of a cult in ritual form and function, and how Nazism itself is sort of a religion separate from the state of Nazi Germany in and of itself. And I'm sure people who are familiar with your work, a lot of them are also familiar with the work of Joseph Farrell. I know you are as well. And I think that you two supplement each other in this regard in a lot of ways. But why don't you take a minute to tell our listeners how you came to eventually do the research to write the book Unholy Alliance. What was it that prompted you to look in that direction and do that research?
Well, it all started for me during Watergate, during the 1970s. I became fascinated by the fact that so many names that cropped up during Watergate were reminiscent of names that had cropped up during the Kennedy assassination. So I started to ask myself, what is this all about? And there was a series of articles in the Village Voice by a journalist called Craig Carpel, called Patriotic Witchcraft. And it was just 2 very brief articles, but it pointed up a lot of the coincidences that surrounded Watergate, the Nixon administration, and the Manson family, and various occult threads. And it created this little explosion in my consciousness. And I said, my goodness, there's a whole different way of looking at reality. And it's based on data. It's not, just something that you dream up. I mean, the dates are there, the facts are there. Let me pursue this. So I began to research what would become Sinister Forces. But in the middle of that, I thought that it's well worth looking at the Nazi phenomenon as an example of how politics and religion, let's say, became fused in the Third Reich. But I didn't know the half of it when I started. So I had gone down to Washington, D.C. Again, it was right at the height of Watergate. Nixon was about to resign. I'm in the National Archives and the Library of Congress, and a very good archivist, a very famous one, Dr. Robert Wolf, that everyone's used, asked me what I was doing there, and I told him, and he said, well, what you have to do is look at this stuff, and he led me to the microfilm records of the SS Ahnenerbe. And for those of us who read Morning of the Magicians back in the 60s, we were tantalized by this idea that there was an occult underpinning to the Nazi Party or to the SS or to the Third Reich. But Morning of the Magicians was really not documented at all. It was these 2 French authors who were in the resistance. They fought against the Nazis, but a lot of what they said made sense, but there wasn't a lot of documentation. And since then, a lot of authors had written a lot of books about Nazi occultism, but again, with no documentation. So I'm looking at these microfilm rolls, and here are the records of a vast occult program, an agency devoted to occultism under the SS, directly reporting to Heinrich Himmler. And I thought, this is great. This is like, I can't believe what I'm looking at. And so there began the research. I began photocopying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents, all in German that I would have to translate later. But I knew enough German to identify what I wanted and to look at this stuff and think, my goodness, there was a Tibet expedition underwritten by the SS? Mm-hmm. Or, my goodness, they were experimenting with yoga, trying to form runic postures, yoga postures based on the German runes. What are they, crazy? And I would go on and look at all of this stuff, and I was fascinated. And that eventually became Unholy Alliance. Was the documentation underpinning of the book. It was originally intended to be only a chapter of Sinister Forces, but then it became, an entire book itself. And as I was researching it, I came across a book by Ladislas Farago, a great World War II historian, called Aftermath, and he talked about a weird cult in Chile where they practiced some strange cult, and they were Nazis, and it was a safe house and all the rest of it. And I decided I would go down there and check it out, which was a very foolish thing to do. Chile was under martial law. They had, overthrown the Allende administration, installed a military dictatorship, and I'm going to go right into the heart of it, to look at a Nazi safe house high up in the mountains. But I did that in 79. I felt invulnerable, I guess. I was 28 years old and, figured I could do anything. And I went down there and was detained by the Nazis at Colonia Dignidad and basically told to get out of the country. So that entire experience formed the basis for Unholy Alliance, that there was a real Nazi presence, a real occult presence within the Nazi Party. That was the main theme, but also that the Nazi cult continued to survive to the present day, that they did not disappear just because they had lost the war. As you mentioned, they're a cult as far as I'm concerned, and cults just don't disappear that easily, especially not when there's been billions of dollars behind them, science, a lot of connections, a lot of political associations, networking across the globe. I just don't see them, giving up and saying, "Oops, well, we lost the war. I guess we were wrong. I guess Jewish people are nice after all." It's not going to happen, right? These were true believers, especially the SS, which is why the SS was considered a criminal organization by the Allies and by the Nuremberg Tribunal. These were true believers in this ideology. These people believed what they were doing. They were not going to just go away. because they lost the war. They were going to regroup, retrench, and come back and see if they could do it again. So I saw that face-to-face in Chile in 1979. And a poor, unfortunate guy after me, a guy called Boris Weisweiler, a guy who had been born in Russia but was an American citizen and a professor in one of the universities at Boston, was hiking in that area a couple of years after me in Chile, maybe 10, 15 miles away. For some reason, the Chilean troops picked him up, security forces picked him up, brought him to the colony, and he was never heard from again. So we found out later that they tortured political prisoners there, that this was a safe house for Nazis on the run. When finally, after Pinochet was out of power and they raided the estate, the Chilean security forces raided it, they found all sorts of documentation, they found all sorts of evidence and proof that the place had been used as a safe house for war criminals. And there was another angle to it, and the angle was that Nazi theoreticians, Nazi ideologues in Chile, considered that particular colony to be a kind of sacred place, a kind of Shambhala, where occult rituals would be performed to reinstitute the Aryan race and the Nazi Party and all the rest of it. So my hunch about it was correct, I think, I'm pretty sure. And since then I've been proven right many times. I mean, the existence of a very strong Nazi Party in Chile, very open Nazi Party, has been demonstrated. Walter Rauff lived there his entire life, died peacefully in Chile, and he was the guy who invented the mobile gas van, where it was the very first gas chamber, which was basically just running a pipe from the exhaust pipe of a van into the back of the van and putting as many prisoners in there as possible and just driving around till they died. This monstrous individual was able to live quite comfortably in Chile his entire life, and that was just one of many Nazis who wound up in Chile. So, this is something we deal with, at the present day, and Unholy Alliance working on it opened my eyes to a lot of that. And so I looked at Sinister Forces, and I said, let's take a look and see what happened after the war in the United States. Let's see if Sinister Forces could be basically Unholy Alliance Part 2, which is basically what it is.
And could we say that the United States interest in various different mind control programs, drug experimentation, and all this sort of thing that the CIA was involved with in the years after World War II, is it safe to say that a lot of this was based on Nazi research and things that were recovered from World War II?
Oh, definitely. There was a very strong interest by our intelligence agencies and the military in what the Nazis had been doing as far as interrogation, brainwashing, breaking down a person's psychological defenses. The documentation exists. There was research on mescaline. There was research on cannabis, sativa, on pot. There was research on a lot of drugs. There was hypnosis research. And one of the scientists we brought over at the end of the war was a guy called Hubertus Struckhold. And Struckhold was considered to be the father of aviation medicine. Now, aviation medicine on its own sounds innocuous enough, right? Mm-hmm. What happens if you cut your finger at 40,000 feet or something? I mean, if you don't think about it, it's what is aviation medicine? But it actually, the experimentation that was conducted in Germany on aviation medicine involved, killing prisoners, killing Jewish prisoners in the camps, subjecting them to low pressure, subjecting them to intense cold, drowning them in ice water, all sorts of horrible experiments which they filmed. And this was Struckhold's area of expertise. Well, at the end of the war, we brought him and a large number of other Nazi so-called scientists who operated in this field. And we brought them to Texas, to Randolph Air Force Base outside of San Antonio. And we basically created an aviation medicine lab for all of these guys to work with at their heart's content. CIA, when the Korean War broke out in 1950, and CIA became crazed over this idea that American prisoners of war were coming back brainwashed, they decided to throw in a lot of money at trying to find out how the communists were doing it, what methods they used, how they could counteract it, and then, of course, how they could do it themselves. So there was a dovetailing of the Nazi research and our American military and intelligence agency research in this regard, again, using unwitting prisoners. The MKUltra program, beginning with Operation Bluebird, which was the very first one, Bluebird, Artichoke, and on to Ultra, and a few other projects since then, had been, using unwitting human subjects. That was the whole point. So that meant they dosed our own soldiers at times with LSD or with other kinds of psychotropic drugs just to see what would happen. The famous case of Frank Olson, a book called A Terrible Mistake, by Hank Albarelli, was published by Trine Day, who you mentioned at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Great. A fascinating look at what really went on in the 1950s during the Cold War and how many rules and laws we broke, in the pursuit of, LSD research on unwitting people again. Just what the Nazis had done by taking prisoners and injecting them with drugs or subjecting them to terrible environmental conditions just to see what would happen. We were doing the same thing. And in many cases, we were doing it to violent criminal offenders in psychiatric hospitals, in criminal psychiatric hospitals. We used massive amounts of drugs on these guys. Now, I'm not particularly sympathetic to someone who's a violent, sexual offender or a murderer, who's also psychologically unbalanced and has to be kept in a special criminal wing, of a psychiatric hospital. But they're human beings like everybody else, and what we did to them was unconscionable in the first place, just totally beyond the pale. But at the same time, when news of this began to leak out, what did we do? Richard Helms, head of the CIA, when he feels that the Watergate commissions are starting to get close, the Rockefeller Commission is getting close, they're breathing down his neck, he shreds all the documentation. So suddenly we have hospitals and prisons full of people who've been subjected to all sorts of weird psychological experimentation, and now we don't know who they are. We don't know what was done to them. There's no follow-up to these people. And who knows how many got parole or wound up back on the street, and they had been subjected to some very strange experimentation. One of my contentions is that some of the serial killer phenomenon that we experience in our country may be traced back to some of these programs. Certainly some of the famous killers did time at some of these same institutions where this experimentation was taking place. Yeah. The problem is now we don't have the documentation because Dick Helms shredded it back in 1975.
Yeah, CIA loves him for that, just like they love Bush for all the work he did for them in covering up during his time as chief of the CIA. That's why they have their headquarters named after him.
Yep.
So, these people are sinister people, to say the least. And I agree with you 100%. Of course, one example of an experimentee is Ted Kaczynski, which you do mention in one of your books as well. And it's kind of ironic that his brother ended up turning him in and then kind of questioning his ultimate culpability later whenever he discovered that his brother had been involved in these sorts of experiments back when he was in college. Which I thought is a rather fascinating story, really, when you think about it.
Well, and when you talk about the occult angle to this, the occult implications for all of this, what CIA was doing, and not just the CIA, but American military intelligence as well, and intelligence agencies around the world, what they were doing by using all of these techniques was basically forcing a kind of spiritual initiation on people. Because the drugs, the hypnosis, the various other techniques that they used are the same techniques that are used in secret societies and in shamanic initiations, where you have sensory deprivation, you're taking certain psychotropic drugs, you're having visions. The difference is that in these societies, there are safeguards built into the program. You're spiritually aware of this. You're not taken unwittingly and forced into this kind of pseudo-initiation. So what the CIA was doing was acting as a kind of cult initiator of a bunch of people who were in no shape to be initiated,
Indeed.
including violent offenders and everybody else they were experimenting on, people who had no knowledge of this and therefore had no way to defend themselves from the fallout. So this, from an occult point of view, it's scary. It's really, really scary. Just imagine a satanic cult, let's say, that just lifts people off the street and then subjects them to all sorts of various initiatory things, and then dumps them on the street and says, "Good luck."
Yes.
I mean, that doesn't happen in other societies. That doesn't happen. We're talking about Freemasons. We're talking about any of the occult initiatory groups. There's always safeguards built in. There's training. There's spiritual adjustments that are made. People are monitored carefully. The initiations go step by step, very gradually. But in the case of CIA, it was a sledgehammer approach. Let's give people, 100 times the dosage of LSD that we would normally give anyone else. Let's just see what happens. It's insane. It was crazy.
It was crazy. I do like the analogy you use, comparing it to a shamanic initiation, and you do point out in the third book in the series, Sinister Forces, how the shaman in his tribe or society sort of went through the initiation process and went through the destruction of himself and his ego and his will and all of the various things that one has to go through, but all internally. And he came to be regarded as a shaman by his people because he had went through the process and came out the other side cured. And it was a process by which they were subjected to that dissociation through the shamanic initiation process and the ultimate cure itself, which placed him in that privileged position to be a shaman for his tribe. And when you look at the mind control programs being done by the various agencies over the years, there was no ultimate cure. All it did was just slam all of this psychic baggage onto people with no ultimate resolution. It was just leaving them screaming in the wilderness, so to speak, in a psychic sense, with no ultimate coming out the other side. And it's a very scary thing when you think about it from an individual perspective. But also one thing that I think you hint at in your books, and I don't know, maybe you do lay it out more clearly, and I just missed it. But one of the things is definitely hinted at very strongly to me is how this has wounded the psyche of our country to a great degree, and that it has gone beyond the individuals who were the witting and unwitting experimentees in these programs, and how it has infested and infected our nation as a whole. Was this an intention that you wanted to get across specifically, or was this just some food for thought? Because I definitely came away with this idea after reading the Sinister Forces book that you viewed what was being done there as sort of a laying open and a laying waste of the psyche of the nation itself, and sort of opening up our entire society to the same sort of trials and tribulations that would assault the people that were the actual people experimented on.
Well, yes, I agree with that. I mean, I refer to the United States as a haunted house in the third book, and it's a haunted house for a number of reasons. We're living, in the first place, in the midst of an ancient civilization that used to be here, that we have totally trashed and ignored. There are fortifications, there are edifices, monuments in our country that we don't even see, which are larger than the pyramids, as precise astronomically as Stonehenge, and older than Stonehenge or the pyramids. I mean, there was a civilization here. The Native Americans might be the survivors of that, and then we slaughtered them. We brought slavery into the country. We did all sorts of things. And then, without being able to process all of this and to come to terms with it, what we did then, especially at the end of World War II and during the Cold War, is we laid bare, as you say, or laid waste our own psyches with this hysteria over the fact that we thought at any moment the Soviet Union was going to invade us and drop bombs. I mean, I grew up in the 50s, and I was one of those people cowering under the wooden desk in our classroom. Bend over and kiss your ass goodbye, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's what we were going to. That was going to save us from a nuclear attack, right? So I mean, we grew up with this fear. We grew up with this hysteria. And so as we're going through again in this country, the same kind of hysteria, the same kind of fear-mongering that we have to put up with, we're going through it again. And we went through it then. And as we went through it, we had organizations that, like CIA, but not just only the CIA, a lot of groups, were then experimenting on our citizens without their knowledge. And it wasn't just the MK Ultra stuff, it was also the chemical biological warfare experiments that took place in our cities, experimenting with various gases in our subway systems and, dumping clouds of stuff over various cities just to see what would happen or how the wind would move a cloud of radiation or something in any direction. I mean, we were experimenting willy-nilly on our own people out of desperation and fear. That at any moment, if we didn't have this knowledge, then the Soviets would come marching through Detroit or something. So, we made a deal with the devil. We brought Nazi scientists over and said, "You're the good Nazis. You're the good guys because you're on our side." And as it turns out, they really weren't. I mean, they sabotaged our space program for the first 10 years or so until Sputnik went up and they got religion. But until that point, they were doing all they could to make sure we would not develop a space program, and that's become revealed in the last few years with greater declassification of files. I mean, there was a lot of sabotage going on. But we brought these guys over after we saw the newsreel footage of the death camps, after we saw what had happened at Auschwitz and Dachau, Treblinka, and all the way up to Peenemünde and Nordhausen, and, the space program itself. When we had the documents that showed that Werner von Braun was involved in those meetings in determining how much slave labor he needed to build the V-1 and V-2 rockets as an SS officer. And there's photographs of him in his black SS uniform. I mean, we brought these people over and said, "Okay, you're part of us now. Help us build a space program." We sold our souls, and the CIA did it when they brought the Galen organization in, to run their intelligence operations in Eastern Europe. We did it when we helped people like Klaus Barbie escape to South America, and Adolf Eichmann and Mengele and everyone else. I mean, and the Vatican also involved in this. The Catholic Church giving these people Vatican passports. What was going through these people's minds? And was it that easy to sell your soul after that? Did the death camps mean nothing? Did all the other atrocities, not just the death camps, but all the atrocities of the Nazi regime, did it really mean nothing? Was it really not that important? What's up with that? So, yeah, it laid waste our psyche. Once we made that decision to bring them over and to basically embrace them, we sold something very, very dear at that point, and people did object. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, went on a rampage trying to stop Operation Paperclip. Harry Truman forbade the Pentagon from bringing Nazis over, and the Pentagon ignored him. So we crossed a line. People knew we were crossing a line. A lot of people were very upset over this, but we crossed that line. And now we've got to find a way to cross back over. We've got to find a way to regain our soul, to ransom it back from these horrible decisions we've made and continue to make.
I think that it's very appropriate that you should point out the various accomplices after the fact probably are more guilty than the people committing the crimes here, in this case the Nazis, because they did what they did knowing full well what the Nazis were engaged in and the true horrific nature of them and their philosophy, and yet they engaged in this activity with that full knowledge. And one could argue that the accomplices after the fact were just as guilty, if not more so, for that very fact alone. And it certainly makes you wonder what kind of hold, what kind of incredible fascination or ideology or whatever that the Nazis possessed that could compel people so readily to give up things that are so what we consider to be so vitally important to ourselves, our individuality, our entire society, our tradition, our everything that we've grown up with, completely sold out and thrown down the sewer, as it were. And the church, as you point out, it's an excellent example, using the Vatican passports to allow Nazis to escape punishment, and ultimately, in a lot of cases, these Nazis ended up working for governments around the world, South America, here in the United States, in the Middle East, for various different countries over there, in official positions as security directors, or being involved with the military and things like this, because they were viewed as highly prominent members of their society, and some of them even lived quite openly in that regard, and it's truly astonishing whenever you think about it from a historical perspective, that these people who were so unalterably evil were just shuffled on down the road so efficiently, and people just, for the most part, I mean, there were people who fought against this, certainly. I'm not going to say there weren't, but for the vast majority of time in history, there was very little done or said to try to bring these people to any kind of justice.
Well, there wasn't, and I think it's important to realize that the evil we're talking about was very individual and specific. It's not just that, well, these were Nazis in general, and the Nazis in general did horrible things. The individual people we brought over were themselves individually responsible for war crimes and atrocities, and that's an important point to make. Our intelligence people, the CIC over there at the end of the war, military intelligence, was processing all of these requests for these scientists, and they were sending back reports saying, you cannot bring this guy into the United States. The guy is a rabid war criminal. He's he killed so many people. I mean, he stepped over the bodies in the V2 factory. I mean, they hung people for minor infractions. All of this stuff, and the Pentagon would simply ignore it and say, no, sorry, we're bringing him over anyway. You're being hysterical. Basically. So we knew, we had full knowledge that the people we were bringing over were themselves individually and specifically evil. They were responsible for terrible war crimes. It's not just in general all the Nazis, were responsible. These guys were themselves specifically responsible, and we know what they did, and we know what they were responsible for, and it didn't matter. We brought them over anyway, and that, I think, that's got to be a greater crime in a sense than the crimes that the Nazis themselves committed. Because we knew what they were doing. The Nazis might have been true believers. They might have sincerely believed what they were doing was for the betterment of humanity. They might have been deluded to that extent, but we weren't deluded, right? We knew what these guys were doing.
Absolutely,
and we didn't care.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point I was trying to make, especially with the church. And I found it quite coincidental. Just before we started the show today, I was checking over the news headlines, and I saw an article about the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, up in the northwest part of the United States, agreed to a settlement for victims of abuse up there, the largest settlement in the history of the church for abuse victims. And wow. I knew, I think it was like $161 million or something like that. So I thought it was kind of a bit of a synchronicity, because I knew it would be touching on the Vatican, the rat lines after World War II, in our discussion about the church.
Sure.
And so, you could see that the church has a significant amount of problems anyway. With the charges of abuse and everything like this, it's not really that hard to conceive that they would be involved in something as atrocious as helping Nazi war criminals escape for whatever purpose they had in mind. So, Yeah, and that's pretty much where I stand on the subject, is that the people after the fact, knowing full well the entire nature of the evil of the individuals involved in Paperclip and the other programs that brought these scientists over to the United States and to other countries, are at least just as guilty, if not more so, because they knew exactly who these people were, and because they went out of their way to change their files specifically from rabid Nazi to not very Nazi at all, not a hardcore Nazi. It's just they changed
exactly. Yeah.
I mean, they just went right in and changed the file and said, "Oh, this guy's not much of a Nazi at all," even though it originally said rabid, horrible Nazi, and you go and change it.
Well, that was exactly the case of Walter Dornberger, for instance, who was Werner von Braun's boss back in Peenemünde, sending the V1s, into England. His file said this guy's a rabid Nazi. You cannot let him into the country, and they simply went through and whited it out, and said, no, he's okay, no big deal, bring him in,
Mm-hmm.
And he later got a board position at Bell Aerospace, go figure. So it's just, it's heartbreaking, and yet, in 1946, 47, I believe it was, Richard Nixon is running for the first time for political office in California, and he's running up against Helen Gahagan Douglas.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a phone call campaign, a telephone campaign, calling all the potential voters and accusing her husband of being secretly Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they're using a smear campaign after we've seen all the film footage of the death camps, as the whole horror of the Holocaust has been revealed, and yet we can still go and make a phone campaign to try to discredit somebody because their husband is Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so soon after the end of the war, this was okay. And then when you look at the Pentagon documentation concerning the scientists, and they're getting letters from various groups, from rabbis saying you can't bring this guy, you can't bring that guy. And the official, documentation, the letters going back and forth within the Pentagon, well, these people are Jewish, so, they have an axe to grind, they can't be considered, we don't have to pay attention to them really, they're obviously emotional about this, I mean, what? Run that by me again, I mean, we're talking about millions of people slaughtered, and you're saying, well, they're just a little emotional about it, we can afford to ignore this, we need these Nazis, My goodness, the talk about being tone deaf. It's unbelievable. And if this is the kind of infrastructure that was running the country in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, you can understand why I was worried that we had sold our soul, that somehow we crossed a line somewhere. We were the good guys, up until 1945, right? We were the good guys. We were defeating fascism. We were defeating Nazism. It was a palpable evil. It was a visible evil. It was so obviously evil. No one could deny that fighting the Nazis was a good thing. No one could sit there and say, no, the Nazis are kind of all right. There was no way to do that. I mean, look at the Hitler speeches and the swastika, banners and the marches and the goose stepping, and forget the camps for a second. Just look at it, and you know what you're looking at. And yet, by 1946, all is forgiven. How did that happen? Right. So.
Right. Exactly. It's a total transformation, a complete reversal. All in the name of national security, I suppose, is what that would be the rationale that would be used. And of course, that's a rationale that's used today to deny people basic civil rights. That's why we have torture being used today, and that's why we have indefinite detention and suspension of habeas corpus and all the other things that have come with the so-called war on terror that we have today, which is exactly like the boogeymen of the Cold War, and it's like having another Cold War. We could eventually be invaded by the terrible terrorists who are going to come and enslave us and do all these terrible things to us, just like the Soviets were going to do for all those years. I'm not as old as you, Mr. Levenda, but I do remember being in grade school, and I do remember getting under my desk for air raid drills, and I do remember going down to the basement for into the so-called fallout shelter, although if a bomb would have landed anywhere nearby, that certainly wouldn't have provided any protection whatsoever, but it was a way to get out of class anyway, so...
Sure.
So, yeah, I do remember those days. A lot of young people now would have no knowledge and no recollection of what that meant, and you know, I'm sure you have had the feeling, as I did when I was a child, and you had when you were growing up, I'm sure, that imminent feeling that was put on us so profoundly by everything that we saw in media and what have you, and I do remember having terrible dreams as a child of nuclear bombs raining down on our cities and being destroyed by the terrible Russians and all the evil that they represented. Of course, a lot of it manufactured by the very Nazis that we supposedly defeated in World War II, with Galen's organization taking over the entire apparatus of our Eastern European intelligence network. It turns out in retrospect that a lot of the so-called intelligence being given to us about Soviet capabilities was completely made up in order to drive our defense industry and to promote spending on defense and furtherance of intelligence and military budgets.
Well, what does that sound like today, right? I mean, here we go again.
Same thing, yeah. It's exactly. It's like a complete repeat of history, and you know, it's very true. It's cliched, but it's so true that those who don't remember history are condemned to repeat it. And of course, so many people today are blind to history that has come on before, and they don't realize that what's going on right now is exactly the same thing that we went through in the Cold War, and it's all based on this fear, and it's based on this idea of you have to give up so many different things in order to protect yourself, and that's the rationale that these people would use for the bringing in of Nazi talent, saying that, well, we need to get ahead of the Russians, and it's a national security thing, and yeah, they might have done some bad things, but what they could contribute is more important, and I just can't. I can't morally grasp that concept, but it's quite obvious that there are people in positions of power and who have been in positions of power in this country and around the world who were quite easily swayed in their morality in looking at this and deciding that this is the way to go for this country, and I'm in complete agreement with you that our country has suffered a major psychic shock. And you talked about the Kennedy assassination and the close association with the Nazis in the Kennedy assassination, in and around that whole affair. And you talked about Walter Dornberger and Bell Aerospace, and Bell was tangentially related to the Kennedy assassination too, by way of the Paines, I believe. Is that not correct? It's been a while since I read. Yeah, it's been a while since I read anything on the JFK assassination. But maybe you could just give us a little bit of information about that, because I'm sure a lot of people would be interested to hear some of the interesting connections there with JFK, because that, of course, is another major wound to the psyche of the nation. The murder of the president for everybody to see in broad daylight, in Dallas.
And then the murder of his brother, 5 years later. I mean,
indeed,
it's the connection is one that I came across totally by accident, and I had never seen it discussed anywhere else. And there's this weird event, and I have to go back a few years before the assassination to talk about a group of people that used to meet up in the woods in the state of Maine in the early 1950s, the time of the Korean War. This is a group of very wealthy, well-placed Americans, blue-blood Americans. We're talking about representatives of the families of the DuPonts, of the Fords, of the Astors, some of the old money Americans. A group of 9 of them would meet up in the woods of Maine, and they would conduct seances. And they were being run by a guy called Puharich, Andrea Puharich. sometimes called Henry or Hank Puharich, who was an officer operating out of Camp Dietrich, the chemical biological warfare station that we had. And he was attempting to find a way to weaponize psychic abilities. He was delivering speeches to the military on this subject. He had medical training. He was a doctor. He was trying to invent various medical apparatuses, but he also had this fascination with psychic phenomena and with spirituality. So he was conducting these seances, and there was this group of people, these 9 individuals, because they were called the 9, and one of them was Arthur Young. Arthur Young is a very well-known name in American spirituality of the latter half of the 20th century. He founded several foundations to conduct research into spirituality. But Arthur Young was the inventor of the Bell helicopter. He started life as an engineer. He invented the helicopter during the war. Once the war was over, gave up engineering and decided to devote himself entirely to the pursuit of spiritual realities, cosmic consciousness, whatever you want to call it. So he got very involved in that, and he married. He married more than once. His last wife was Ruth Forbes Payne Young. So that's all of her husband's names strung out there, sort of like Elizabeth Taylor, God rest her soul. So you had Ruth Forbes. The Forbes family was there, which is John Kerry's is related to that family. His middle name was Forbes. So we have the Forbes family, the Payne family, which is one of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence. Her husband was a direct descendant of the Payne who signed the Declaration. And Ruth Forbes Payne Young, right. And Young, of course, was Arthur Young. Well, his stepson was a man called, Arthur Young's stepson was Michael Payne. Michael Payne worked for Bell Aerospace out of Texas. And he's married to another Ruth Payne, a Quaker. And it's Ruth Payne who provided the home for Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife Marina and their children when they were looking for work. The story was that Ruth Payne wanted to learn Russian. And, of course, Lee Oswald was married to a Russian woman, Marina Oswald, the niece of a military intelligence colonel. So they've defected to Russia, Lee Oswald. He's defected back again into the United States. They're living in Texas. And Marina and the kids are staying with Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne helps Lee Oswald find the job at the Texas School Book Depository. In September of 1963, Ruth Payne, Michael Payne's wife, goes up to visit Arthur Young in Pennsylvania. They live outside of Philadelphia. So she went up to visit them. We don't know what was discussed. All we know is that she comes back into Texas, and within 2 months, the president is assassinated. Now, it's strange coincidence to look at this picture. Here we have these people conducting a seance in Maine. They're making contact with extraterrestrial beings who are charging them with a new mission on the Earth, according to what I've read about the 9, to what Puharich himself has written. So, within a few years, Arthur Young, one of the original 9, and his wife, Ruth, one of the original 9, 2 out of the 9, are intimately involved with Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin of the president. Well, that's bad enough, but it doesn't stop there. There's a number of other people around Lee Harvey Oswald who also have connections back to that group in Maine in the 1950s. So he didn't have a chance. He was surrounded by these people. And then he goes out to commit this assassination, supposedly. The people that he worked with at, I think it was the O'Reilly Coffee Company in New Orleans, just shortly before he moved to Texas to commit the assassination. Virtually everyone in that company who were his co-workers, about 8 or 9 of them, as I recall, they all immediately after the assassination got jobs working in the space program, either with NASA, with JPL, or with something connected to the space program. They all got these great jobs. They disappeared, basically, from New Orleans and wound up working for NASA. So, I mean, the coincidences multiply and multiply like crazy. And it's difficult for me to look at all of this, with a jaundiced eye and say, well, it's just, coincidence. I don't think so, If it is coincidence, then it's the evidence of something deeper and darker at work. Because how is it that these people who conducted seances in Maine are now involved with the Kennedy assassination? Mm-hmm. So Ruth Payne, the woman living in Texas who lived with Marina Oswald, is basically the one who turns in Lee Harvey Oswald. She finds his, she gives photographs to the police. She volunteers a lot of information for a Quaker. She volunteers a lot of information and gets this guy basically in jail without any legal representation. And she's then questioned after all of this by the Warren Commission, right? So now Allen Dulles, the man that Kennedy blamed for the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the man he fired as head of CIA, Allen Dulles is now part of the Warren Commission, and he's sitting in on the interrogation.
That's like having your worst enemy in charge of your investigation.
Oh yeah, sure, exactly.
Come on, really. Go ahead. Yeah. I'm sorry I interrupted you. Go ahead.
But it is hysterical. I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. But anyway, there's Allen Dulles. Okay, he's sitting in, and he's part of the Warren Commission. Ruth Payne now is giving testimony, and her visit to Philadelphia comes up, right? Mm-hmm. I'm reading the Warren Commission testimony. There's Ruth Payne saying, oh, yes, well, in September I went up to Philadelphia, and then suddenly Allen Dulles breaks in to this. If you read the transcript, it's very unusual. He changes the subject right in the middle. As Ruth Payne is about to say, I went up to Philadelphia to talk to Arthur Young and Ruth Forbes Payne, blah, 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 et cetera, he stops her dead, changes the subject, and then that's the end of it. We never get to hear the rest of that story, and we haven't heard it even until today. So I started wondering, well, why did Dulles change the story? What more did Dulles know about this, that he wasn't telling, that he felt he had to be there? And as it turns out, Allen Dulles had a mistress, Mary Bancroft. And his mistress, Mary Bancroft, was best friends with Arthur Young's wife, Ruth Forbes Payne Young. They were best friends, and Mary Bancroft told everything to Ruth. Dulles knew this. He could not have his mistress's connections. The whole thing would have exploded. It would have been really weird that there was a direct connection between Dulles, his mistress, Ruth Forbes Payne, Ruth Payne, and Oswald. 6 degrees of separation, but really close, a really tight connection. So Dulles had to derail that investigation, that testimony, and he did successfully. Nothing more was ever said about it.
It's very interesting. And of course, when you look at Oswald and all the different connections with the Kennedy assassination and everything, it's just unbelievable. You can't even. I mean, you couldn't make it up if you were trying to write a fiction story. All of the so-called coincidences and synchronicities. One of the things that I think is true, Peter, maybe you'd agree with me, is that when you make forays into areas where perhaps you should not be treading, like in the dissolution of people's psyches with drugs and manipulation, like in MK Ultra, and the laying waste of the psyche of the country with the open assassination of the president for everybody to see in the middle of broad daylight, and you do all of these things. It disrupts our collective consciousness in a certain way, and I think that it produces a level of coincidence and synchronicity as a way of drawing our attention to it, because it's something that needs to be seen in order to be maybe cured of, showing us where we have a deficiency, where we have a problem that we need to confront, that we need to face, that we need to try and overcome. And it seems to me that coincidence and synchronicity and all of these, whatever term you want to give for the types of things that show up around all of these, various phenomena like the assassination is kind of a way of our collective consciousness saying, hey, you need to look at that because that is the beginning of some trauma or something that you need to come to terms with or to try to better understand. What do you think about that?
I would agree with you. I think that it's a little bit like the tension that exists between science and religion. We can look at these events very dispassionately from an academic kind of historical perspective, as I've sometimes tried to do, to try to be very, without interjecting myself too much into the discussion, but science cannot provide meaning for us. The weakness of science is that it can tell us the how something happens, but not the why. And I think that what the coincidence or the synchronicities do is it points in the direction of the why. We can labor to death all of the details surrounding the Kennedy assassination. Who knew what? Who did what to whom? Who was in contact with whom? We know that E. Howard Hunt on his deathbed admitted that there was a plot to kill the president, that they had initially intended to kill him in Miami and eventually killed him in Texas. We can look at all of this and ask ourselves, why haven't the walls come tumbling down, with that revelation? Why hasn't everything come to a complete standstill with a deathbed confession by E. Howard Hunt, which would be admissible in any court in the country as a deathbed utterance, as the truth? Why will we not accept that? Why have we suddenly decided to ignore this these days? Why is that no longer important? And I think that the coincidences point up a kind of, I hate to use the word spiritual all the time, esoteric maybe too drastic a term, I don't know, but anyway, there's another dimension to our history that is full of meaning, just as our lives are full of meaning for us. Why does one person get cancer and the person next to him doesn't? Why does the roof fall on this one person, that person survives? Science can say this is how it happened, but they can't say why it was you and not me. They can't offer that degree. And I think what coincidence and synchronicity is doing is it's pointing us in the why, in the direction of the why. They're saying, yes, the president was killed, a bullet went into his brain. This is the how it happened. But why did it happen? And for the why, we have to go back, in the case of the Kennedy assassination, probably to that Belgian mystic I mentioned in Sinister Forces, Maurice Maeterlinck, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, who wrote a play in which there is an assassination of the president. Shots are fired from the grassy knoll. We're not sure if it was 3 shots were fired or 4. The guy who did the shooting is called Alec, which was Lee Harvey Oswald's name in Russia, his nickname. I mean, all of this was written before Jack Kennedy was born, right? And yet the entire scenario is laid out. And the assassination was believed to have been carried out on behalf of Russia, according to the play. I mean, when you prefigure something like that, when an event takes place that causes ripples backwards in time as well as forwards in time, you have to look at it and say, okay, there's a why here that we have to look at. We have to understand why this is happening. And there are only moral and ethical questions at that point to be raised. There's only the question is, who are we? What have we done? Why is this trauma taking place? Let's look very closely at this issue, at this political event, at this assassination, or whatever it is, and try to derive from it some meaning so that we can go on in a more positive way, that we can go on in a way that does not force us into the same rut over and over again, because the hows they're not solving the problem anymore. Now we need whys. We need to answer some of those why questions very, very much. I think I went through, as you mentioned, the Cold War. I saw all of this happening, in the days after World War II. And now I'm seeing history repeating itself again. And I think that we have to ask some serious questions about who are we as a people? How do we get to this point? How did we let it happen? How did we let the fox guard the hen house for so long? All of these things we really have to address. And I hope Sinister Forces raises enough questions that people can say, wow, something has been going on. Whether it's a conspiracy or not, there is something deeper at work, and we need to work on ourselves psychologically. Let's say, get some depth analysis going, as to the U.S. the American psyche, and just find out what some of these traumas are, some of these national neuroses and national psychoses, and see if we can unravel some of this.
Oh, I think you said it very well there, and I can't iterate enough for all the listeners out there. If you have not read the books, the Sinister Forces trilogy, I highly recommend that you get them, because, as Peter just pointed out, there is a tremendous amount of information to digest in the books, but more importantly, it does point you in the direction of asking very important questions that are very relevant for our time and for our nation and for our people, and for you as an individual as well, because we're all in this together, as many people have said, and I cannot recommend the books highly enough. If you're thinking about getting them, I would suggest that you go to Trine Day and buy them directly from there, but you can also use the scroll on the episode page here for the radio, which is linked up to Amazon.com if you want to buy the books. I strongly encourage you to do so, because they really are a great investment, and they're a fantastic reading. We don't have much time left, Peter, but I wanted to get into a couple of additional topics before we finish. And the first one I wanted to ask you about was the idea that Hoagland and some others have suggested, and this will go into the program you're going to be involved with next week, the Secret Space program, is the idea that there is in fact a second space program operating within the United States that is not for public consumption, that is engaged in activities that we don't know about, possibly using technology that we don't know about as a public. And I wanted to get your insight into that, if you have anything to add in that regard.
Well, I think one of the side effects of the war on terror that began in earnest after September 11th was an increased level of secrecy and classification that takes place within our government now. If you're a journalist, you know how difficult it is these days to get an answer to a Freedom of Information Act request. They're almost routinely denied now. It's very difficult to get anything out, even some very tame stuff. Secrecy has become a new way of life, just as it was during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. So now we are facing a situation where we don't really know what's going on. I think that I mentioned it just the other day, actually. Someone else asked me a similar sort of question. What I said was we had the Manhattan Project during World War II, in which we were successfully able to develop atomic weapons without having anyone know we were doing it. Mm-hmm. Secrecy is possible in our government. It's not as as silly or as stupid or as inefficient as we sometimes like to think. There is a possibility that things can take place on a secret level, that technologies exist of which we are not aware, mm-hmm. or applications of those technologies, let's say. So a secret space program, I tend to believe that there would be. Why wouldn't there be? Why would there not be a secret space program, if you think about it? I've been saying a number of times over the past couple of years that if there is a space program for sure, who is going to benefit from it, really? If the idea of the space program is to leave the planet because it's becoming uninhabitable, gradually it will become uninhabitable if things progress the way they are, then who's going to leave? Who's going to have the first seats on those flights? Do you think it's going to be the poor or even the middle class? Do you think they're going to come to our homes and give us tickets? I don't think so. I was making an analogy to the last scene of the movie Dr. Strangelove, since we're talking Cold War.
Oh, yes.
A great film, very funny film. Peter Sellers played, I think, three or four different roles in that film. The last scene is, of course, the world's on the brink of annihilation. Missiles have been launched in all directions. And so the only thing they can think of is they have to get to a safe bunker and preserve the seed of America, right? So they can repopulate the world. And, of course, the best and the brightest are in that room, which means a bunch of military generals, a couple of politicians, and the Russian ambassador, and that's what's going to repopulate the world at the end. I mean, think about it.
Yes.
If there is a space program, you and I are not going to be on that ship, so there's no way they're going to advertise this fact, right?
Yeah.
Because they'd have a revolution on their hands.
Yeah.
So it's got to be done in secret. If there is space travel, if we have crossed that line and we have a star drive of some kind, if we have an alternate source of energy, if we've been able to bend time or use wormholes or whatever the technology is, you think they're going to tell us? It's just not going to happen.
I think that's that. I think that perhaps you've hit upon the real way of putting that, of stating it, and that is to ask the question, why would there not be, rather than is there?
Sure.
It's much better to look at it in that regard, especially whenever you delineate all the different things that you've pointed out. And I would also iterate in relation to the movie that you were talking about with Peter Sellers. Not a very good movie, 2012, with John Cusack, but perfectly serving as an example of what you're talking about, because the people who were going to be saved in the movie 2012 were not everyday, ordinary people. These were the incredibly rich people who could afford to pay their way onto the arcs in the movie 2012. Right. So for all of its faults, it does illustrate a basic truth, and that is that in the case of something like that actually happening, those are the people who are going to be the ones that are going to be taken off in the spaceships or the arcs or whatever. It's not going to be me and you.
No, it's not going to be me and you. Get that thought out of your mind. Right.
So yes, and I think it's such an excellent way to put that, is to ask why wouldn't there be, rather than is there, because it definitely puts it into better perspective. Now, one of my...
And if there is...
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and if there is such a program, it's going to have to be secret. There is no way they're going to leak that information out. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. One of my guests wanted me to ask you about the Voynich manuscript, one of my chat room guests here. Do you have any insight into the Voynich manuscript? Have you looked into it at all?
It's funny that gets mentioned, because over the last 6 to 8 months or so, I've been really looking at it very carefully. I've been trying to decode it in a way that makes sense to me, and it is really impenetrable. I've been doing the best that I can. I've been trying to look at the writing and trying to place where that coded system might have originated. I've been looking at the drawings of the buildings, of the drawings of the people and the plants, and the astrological symbols and everything. It is really, it's of course, it's defied everybody's attempts to decode it, and I'm not getting much better with it. But there was a point at which I wondered if it wasn't more Asian than it was European in origin. Some of the buildings suggested that to me. Some of the writing, even some of the plants suggested that it might have been Asian. And then I came across, in my travels, I was in Asia recently, I came across this mural on the side of a wall which showed all of these women bathing in a large pool. And it reminded me of the Voynich manuscript right away.
Absolutely,
I thought, wow, what is this? And I asked the person, and I said, what does this represent? And it evidently was a scene out of the Mahabharata, having to do with goddesses bathing and another god coming along and finding them. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because one of the strangest parts of the Voynich manuscript are all of these human figures. They're all female, and they're all bathing, and there's pipes showing water going everywhere, and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But if it's referring to something mythological, and reinforcing that image, then it might make sense. So I have been working on it. I really don't know. I can't really offer much more than that. But it was a striking image that I suddenly came across in the middle of nowhere. I mean, in Southeast Asia, in a small town. So it was striking, for sure.
I never heard anything at least in what I've read about the Voynich manuscript, which admittedly is not a lot, but I am somewhat familiar with it. I've never heard it expressed in a connection with maybe Eastern philosophy. I mean, most of the attempts at decipherment have focused on European history and
sure.
and that sort of thing. So that definitely would open up a complete new avenue of research if that was some kind of a treatise that was incorporating ancient Indian mythology into it. Would be a really fascinating thing if it's ever eventually decoded and anybody ever comes up with a proper answer as to exactly what it is. But it is a fascinating thing to look at anyway. Well, thanks for contributing that. So we'll look forward to anything that you have about it in the future. Certainly your insights are greatly appreciated. So,
well, if I decode it, believe me, I'll let you know.
I'm sure. We'll hear about it, yes, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the last thing I wanted to ask you about before we're finished here, because we have about 15 minutes left, I just wanted you to touch on Charles Manson a little bit. And my take after reading Sinister Forces and how Manson is woven through the entire narrative is that Manson for you, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so please correct me if I'm mistaken. Manson for you in the book is sort of like an expression of the totality of all of the evil being expressed in one person, and he's kind of like he's like a manifestation, an individual manifestation of all the collective psychoses that the country has undergone. Not necessarily being manufactured himself, although that's certainly possible through the prison system that he was so into for all of his life, and his engagements with Scientology and all these other different groups throughout the years. But I got the feeling that he's just kind of like a I don't know, like maybe a representation of the collective psyche of the nation, wounded and thrown on the side of the road. I don't know. Is that fair to say, or am I way off with that?
No, I like that way of characterizing it. Manson to me is a very complex individual, complex question. I started off Sinister Forces with in the back of my mind that famous, or to me famous, quotation by Ed Sanders, where he said, "If the Pentagon ever formulates the Manson secret, the world is in trouble." And I thought, well, we did formulate the Manson secret. I mean, Manson himself is proof that we formulated the Manson secret. You know, the idea of being able to get a lot of other people to do our dirty work for us. Quite often our political leaders or our military leaders, they're not the ones to pull the trigger. Manson killed no one in the Tate LaBianca killings. He was not actually there. He sent people out to do his bidding. They went out and killed in his name. But he himself actually didn't kill anyone. I mean, he may have killed people in his life. I'm not saying he didn't. But as far as Tate LaBianca, he didn't. So, yet he was the one accused. He's the one that's never getting out because of it. And I thought, how interesting that, you know, we are able to use this guy who's been in the prison system his entire life, horribly abused as a child, all these other things that we know about Manson, and yet we're convinced that he's evil. And yet we can't look at other people in our lives who do exactly the same thing, who take no responsibility, who order people to kill, send people to their deaths, and they are blameless, you see. So Manson himself even pointed that out. He said he was convicted of witchcraft in the 20th century, another one of his quotations, and it's true. You know, we went nuts, we went crazy where Manson was concerned because he looked weird, you know, and he talked in this gnomic way that he had. So obviously he had to be, you know, thrown in jail for the rest of his life. You know, I'm not saying he shouldn't have been. The guy is, you know, from what I've seen in interviews that I've seen since then, on the one hand, he seems to be kind of brilliant, and on the other hand, totally insane. So maybe he's exactly where he wants to be. But, we rushed to judgment on that one. We wanted to put this guy away. And there was a lot more to the Manson story than we knew about at the time, and it has since come out. There's been a lot more going on. Were those killings for hire, for instance?
Mm-hmm.
There's that whole story. There's a lot about Manson we're never going to know. Just like there's a lot about David Berkowitz, the son of Sam Killer, we're never going to know, or Mark David Chapman, the guy who killed John Lennon. They're all in prison. Berkowitz never had a trial. Chapman never had a trial. They all pled guilty. They're all thrown in jail. We never heard their stories.
Mm-hmm.
And the only story we heard from Manson was, stories where he was not really allowed to talk in court. So I don't know. Manson is a kind of touchstone for me. Certainly kind of crystallizes a lot of things. I mean, Manson was declared to be guilty by Nixon while the trial was in progress.
Yeah.
There was that famous headline, "Manson guilty, Nixon declares." That should have caused a mistrial, and it didn't.
Yeah, he held the paper up in the courtroom. Manson
and
did.
Showed it to the jury.
Yeah, he showed it to the jury, and the judge didn't declare a mistrial. Yeah, which
it should have been right there, right there, the mistrial.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think what was funny about that was the judge asked the jury, "Will any of you be, influenced by the president's remark?" And they said, "No, not particularly."
Ironically, that probably would have been true, Peter.
Yeah,
most of the
probably.
People probably wouldn't have cared what Nixon had to say on the subject.
Exactly.
But that's another issue altogether.
Yeah.
Well, certainly Manson is a fascinating character. Just the history and so much of his history is still shrouded and not really well known. And in that sense, he's a lot like Oswald, and he's a lot like a lot of these other characters that have come and gone in American history that are almost enigmas in and of themselves. And
yet their influence was so strong,
Yeah.
Their influence in our culture was so deep, and yet we know nothing about these people, or next to nothing. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and studying them and trying to understand, where they come from and how they were created and everything. And I think in your books, in the series where you talk about the serial killers, maybe some of them being the end product of mind control programs conducted in this country and things of this nature, is very valid for people to consider whenever they try to understand phenomena that are outside of our ability to grasp in an everyday sort of way. I think whenever, and I think you touched upon this very well in the third book when you were talking about this a little more in depth, and that is with the idea of the serial killer is it's like a thing that we can't categorize, and we had to come up with a totally new phraseology and an idea to express something that we didn't really have any basis to understand, because we have people doing things that only have meaning or any kind of ideas behind them for the person themselves, and we can't understand people operating in such a outsider fashion, and someone had to come up with a new term, serial killer, to describe the actions of people that are doing things that are so outside of our realm of experience. And I think that when you're trying to put the pieces together to try to understand, the various things that are going on in our culture and society, it's very important to understand where some of the roots are. And I think that your writing has certainly opened up a lot of doors for people to go down to try and follow different trails to come to conclusions and try to come to some answers, when it comes to all of these very difficult things.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And like I said, I can't recommend your work enough. From Unholy Alliance all the way up through the Sinister Forces series. Of course, you did do work on the Freemasons.
Yep.
And in the last couple minutes here, maybe you could tell us what you're working on right now. Of course, I did mention you're going to be doing the Secret Space program in Amsterdam in April. And that's, let me see, when is that? That's April 3rd. Yeah, April 3rd. You'll be doing the Secret Space program in Amsterdam. Why don't you tell everybody what you're working on right now and what we can expect from you in the future?
Well, aside from the space program seminar in Amsterdam, I have another book coming out in September, if all goes well, and it's a look at the tantric temples of Indonesia. I've been spending some time in Indonesia I was startled to learn that in the largest Muslim country in the world, which is Indonesia, 200 million plus Muslims living there, that there's a tantric tradition that's still alive and well. So it kind of is a deviation from my normal, politics, history, occult thing, but there's still a bit of that in this book. I'm fascinated by the connection between occultism and politics because I think that's a rich load of investigation there. And in Indonesia, you have fascinating architecture. You have just hundreds of temples. In the island of Java alone, you have temples everywhere. And they're tantric. I mean, they're devoted to Hindu Buddhist Tantra, which was the type of religious mysticism involved with sacred sexuality, you might say. So this book is going to be heavily illustrated, just many, many photographs. I think we've lost count. It's around 100 or so full-color photographs of the temples, explaining what they are, some of which are still in use today, and trying to explain the mindset of a people that considers itself Muslim, Islamic, and at the same time is tolerant enough to accommodate these other points of view and these other practices. So that's coming out in September, and I'm working on another book now dealing with a particular escaped Nazi war criminal. I don't want to go into too much detail yet because I'm right in the middle of that investigation, but that book may also be coming out this year or maybe early next year. I'm right in the middle of that right now.
Okay, excellent. Well, that sounds really good. I look forward to both of them. Is there a website that people can keep up with you and find your work, or find? Do you have a blog or anything like that you want to promote?
Sure. I mean, you can look at the website that we've set up under Trine Day. It's called sinisterforces.info, I-N-F-O, sinisterforces.info. I have a blog up there. Quite often our site is hacked and my blogs are taken down by people who have an axe to grind. The famous case was one I did about John McCain. I suggested he might have been a Manchurian candidate. Well, for some reason, that blog posting got covered by a lot of other news groups, and then we were relentlessly hacked, and the blog posting disappeared even from Internet Archives. So somebody obviously took great exception to that tongue-in-cheek article on John McCain. But so we've had occasional problems with it. So you'll find that I don't update it as much as I should, or if I do update it, sometimes the postings disappear into cyberspace somewhere. But sinisterforces.info is a good place to look, and it's also a place where you could order Sinister Forces, the books themselves from Trine Day.
Okay, excellent, very good, very good. Well, again, Peter, I want to thank you for coming on the show today, and remind everybody, sinisterforces.info. You can check out. It has links to Trine Day, where you can get the 3 books in the series, Sinister Forces. Also, Peter's written Unholy Alliance. He's written a book on the Freemasons. And like I said, also in the episode page there's a scroll with a couple of samples of Peter's work. And if you click on those, they'll take you directly to Amazon.com, where you can buy some of his other works as well. And I had a fascinating discussion with you today, Peter, and hope to have you on in the future sometime again, where we can get into a little more detail in some more areas of fascinating research that you've uncovered for us. So
I look forward to it.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, Peter. I hope you have a great evening, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, everybody. That was Peter Levenda, and I just want to thank him very much for being on the show. I want to remind everybody that I'll be back here next week, 7 to 9 p.m., for another episode of The Stench of Truth. Don't forget to check me out on YouTube if you're interested in politics and economics, and a little bit of profanity thrown in there every once in a while as well. Please check me out on YouTube. It's youtube.com/user/tenebrous-t, TENEBROUST. Check out my blog at tenebrous-t-thestenchoftruth.blogspot.com. Check out my political platform ideas at platformforthefuture.com/main. That's platformforthefuture.com/main for political action items if you're politically motivated. And I'll hope to see you all next week. Thanks for joining me for another edition of The Stench of Truth.